The market district of Valethorn City had a particular rhythm to its evenings. Stalls folding inward like closing flowers, merchants counting coins with tired fingers, the smell of the day's bread and sawdust and animal fat slowly giving way to the cooler, cleaner air of dusk. It was the hour when humans who knew better gathered their things and moved toward the lower gates, leaving the upper streets to the dragons who had always owned them. Edric Mann knew better. He simply didn't always act on it. He was a tinker of modest reputation and modest means, a mender of small, broken things that other people had given up on. His cart held the tools of 30 years of careful work. Tiny screwdrivers worn smooth at the handles, pliers in 4 different gauges, jars of resin and oil and fine ground solder, yet a magnifying lens clipped permanently to his coat lapel like a badge of his particular calling. He was packing them away with the methodical patience that defined everything he did, each tool returning to its designated pocket, each jar sealed and nested safely. He was nearly finished when he heard it. It came from the narrow alley beside the cobbler's shop, a sound that took a moment to identify because it was so incongruous with its surroundings. Small, wet, a hitching, stuttering sob that caught and caught again like a wheel stuck in mud, the sound of something trying very hard to stop crying and failing completely at the effort. Edric's hands paused on his satchel clasp. He was a practical man. He had sore knees, a long walk ahead, and a dinner waiting that was already well past warm. The alley was dark, the hour was late, and whatever was making that sound was, statistically, none of his business. He told himself this clearly and specifically, in the firm internal tone he used for sensible decisions. Then he picked up his satchel, left his cart latched to the post, and turned toward the sound. Some men were built for walking past things. Edric Ma. The alley was narrow enough that the last of the evening light barely reached its floor, filtering down in a thin gray stripe between the leaning rooftops. Edric stepped into it carefully, one hand on the cobbler's wall for orientation, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. He followed the sound. Still hitching, still wet, still that exhausted quality of grief that has been going on longer than it should. He found her near the far end, pressed against the stone wall as though trying to make herself smaller than she already was. A dragon hatchling. Edric had seen adult dragons in the city, of course. Everyone in Valethorn had. It was that kind of city. He had seen them in their natural forms and in the human shapes they adopted for market dealings, had learned to recognize the particular stillness they carried even when disguised. But he had never been this close to a hatchling before. And for a moment he simply stopped and took her in with the quiet attention he gave to everything he encountered. She was extraordinary in the way that very young things often are, not yet grown into the severity that age would bring. Her scales held that early iridescence, shifting between deep emerald and soft gold, depending on how the faint light caught them, the way a soap bubble holds color before it breaks. Her wings were folded tight against her sides in the instinctive posture of distress, and her small claws were pressed flat to the cobblestones. She was no larger than a big dog, and she was crying with the uninhibited totality that only the very young can manage. Great luminous tears rolling freely down her snout and dropping to the ground, where they pooled in the grout between the stones like scattered drops of liquid sunlight. She was alone. Completely, entirely alone. Some part of Edric's mind registered that this was wrong in serious and complicated ways, that hatchlings of any status were not left unattended in city alleys, that her presence Edric crouched down the moment he saw her flinch, dropping slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller and less like a threat. He had learned this with cats first, then frightened children, then eventually with most living things that had reason to be wary of the world. You didn't advance. You lowered yourself, made your hands visible, and you waited. He waited. The hatchling pressed harder against the wall for a moment, a small, involuntary puff of smoke escaping her nostrils. The dragon equivalent, he supposed, of a sharp intake of breath. Her golden eyes watched him with the particular calculation of a young creature, weighing danger against desperation, running that ancient internal arithmetic of is this safe, is this safe, is this safe? He kept still, kept his hands open and visible at his sides. He kept his face the way he kept it when he was working, calm, focused, unhurried, projecting as best he could the simple fact that he intended nothing except to be present. The calculation resolved. It happened the way these things always happened with children. Not gradually, but in a single surrendered moment, the walls coming down all at once because holding them up had simply become too exhausting. Her small shoulders dropped, the tight-folded wings relaxed by a fraction. And then, with the heartbreaking certainty of a child who has been alone with something too heavy and can no longer bear the weight of it, she held out her claws. Edric looked at what she offered him. It was a bird, mechanical, brass-feathered, the kind of intricate and expensive toy sold only in the upper market stalls where the prices were never written down because the people shopping there didn't need to ask. It had been beautiful once. He could see that clearly even now. Each feather was its own individual piece, layered with a craftsman's care, designed to catch light the way real feathers caught wind. Spring-loaded wings, a chime mechanism in the breast that would have... The cobblestones were cold and grimy and entirely unsuitable for sitting on, which Edric noted and dismissed in the same moment. He had sat in worse places in service of better work. He settled himself cross-legged on the alley floor with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had long since made his peace with the indignity of his profession, set his satchel open beside him, and brought the broken bird into the thin remaining light. The hatchling watched him with an expression he recognized, that fragile, suspended stillness of someone trying very hard not to hope too much, in case the hoping made the disappointment worse. He had seen it on children who brought him their most precious broken things, on elderly men presenting cracked pocket watches that had belonged to fathers they missed. He treated it the same way every time, not with reassurance, which was cheap, but with immediate and genuine attention to the problem itself. He turned the bird carefully in his fingers and began to look. He did not notice in that moment the figure on the balcony above. She had been there for less than 2 minutes, arrived at the overlooking ledge by a route that involved considerably more haste than a queen of her standing would typically permit herself, her burgundy traveling clothes still slightly disordered from the speed of her search. Sarathiel Voss was 600 years old and had learned, across those centuries, to keep her face and body as still and readable as carved stone when she chose. That stillness served her now as she stood at the balcony's edge and looked down into the alley below and found what 12 minutes of frantic, quietly conducted searching had failed to locate. Her granddaughter, sitting on filthy cobblestones beside a human she had never met, alive, unharmed, leaning forward with an expression of cautious, dawning hope. Corvin materialized at her shoulder, her head guard's massive presence announcing itself with the faint displacem. For a long moment, Sarathiel simply breathed. It was something she had learned to do deliberately across the centuries, to take the space between observation and reaction, to let what she was seeing fully register before she decided what it meant. Younger dragons acted on instinct. Older ones had learned, sometimes painfully, that instinct was simply pattern recognition dressed in urgency, and patterns could be wrong. So she breathed, and she looked, and she let herself see clearly. Her granddaughter was not lost, not taken, not frightened into some stranger's grip, not cornered or threatened or in any of the dozen dangers that had populated Sarathiel's imagination across the last 12 minutes with increasing and unqueenly vividness. Vathis was sitting on a dirty alley floor beside a human man of no particular distinction, and watching him hold her broken toy up to a magnifying lens with an expression on her small face that Sarathiel recognized with a complicated rush of feeling. It was the expression of a child who has decided, against considerable prior caution, to trust. Corvin leaned forward at her shoulder, drawing breath with the particular deliberateness of someone who has prepared a sentence and believes it to be important. Sarathiel said one word, quiet, flat, final as a door closing, and the breath released without the sentence attached. She did not look at him. She did not need to. 600 years of authority had given her a tone that communicated everything necessary without requiring her attention to deliver it. She kept her eyes on the alley. The tinker had a magnifying lens clipped to his eye. A jeweler's loupe, she noted. Not the kind of tool that indicated habitual close work rather than occasional need. His hands were moving over the bird with a methodical care that she recognized across species and context, because it was the same care she had seen in the best craftspeople she had patronized across her reign, not the showy pressy. Edric had developed the habit of narrating his work somewhere in his second decade as a tinker, and he had never fully been able to explain it to anyone who asked. It wasn't performance. It wasn't teaching, exactly. It was closer to the way some people talked to plants, or the way old sailors narrated the weather to no one in particular. A natural externalization of the internal process, thought given shape in air. When he worked in his room alone, he did it to the objects themselves, murmuring observations at stubborn gears and cracked housings as though they might cooperate better if they understood what he was attempting. With people present, it simply redirected, becoming a quiet, continuous thread of explanation that he offered without expectation of response. The hatchling did not respond in any language he could parse, but she listened. He could tell by the way her head tilted, the way her golden eyes tracked from his face to his hands and back again, following the words to their corresponding actions with an attention that was entirely genuine and entirely focused. He told her about the wing joint first, how it was designed to rotate in a specific arc, how forcing it backward against that arc had bent the brass rather than breaking it cleanly, which was actually fortunate because bent could be coaxed while broken needed replacing. He showed her with the fine-nosed pliers the slow, careful pressure that eased metal back toward its intended shape without moving the stress somewhere new. He explained why he stopped and released and started again rather than pushing through, that patience here was not timidity but precision, and that the difference between a repair and a second break was knowing when to ease off. She had started the conversation a careful body length away from him. She was now close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her scales, that particular dry living heat that he had heard dragons ran warmer than most creatures. Sarathiel had excellent eyesight. All dragons did. It was one of the gifts of their nature that human form did not diminish, the ability to resolve fine detail at distances that would leave most species squinting at blur. From 30 feet above the alley floor, she could see the tinker's hands with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its specificity. They were not young hands. The knuckles were enlarged in the way of people who had spent decades doing close, repetitive work in cold conditions. The skin was mapped with old scars, the small, precise kind, nicks from tools and edges, the occupational markings of a profession that required working close to sharp things for a very long time. 2 of his fingernails were permanently darkened with metal residue that washing had long since stopped being able to fully address. They were, by any external measure, unremarkable hands, the hands of an ordinary working man of middling years and modest means who had spent his life doing modest work, and they were moving across the surface of her granddaughter's toy with a care so genuine and so focused that Sarathiel found herself unable to look away from them. She had negotiated with kings. She had sat across tables from human rulers who had offered her elaborate performances of respect, while their eyes calculated advantage, who had learned the formal gestures of regard the way one learns steps to a dance, correctly, completely, and without any of the feeling the dance was designed to express. She had understood this about humans for centuries, had factored it into every treaty, every agreement, on every careful alliance built on the bedrock of mutual benefit rather than anything so unreliable as genuine feeling. She had understood them. She had been quite certain she understood them thoroughly. But there was a distinction, she was finding, between the knowledge of a thing observed across a long distance and the knowledge of a thing seen close and specific. The sound was small, a soft, precise click that would have been swallowed entirely by any ambient noise. But in the quiet of the alley, it arrived with the clarity of something important. The hatchling's head came up instantly. It was the movement of a creature who had been trying very hard to hope carefully and had just been given without warning a reason to hope less carefully. Her golden eyes went wide, fixed on the bird in Edric's hands, and for a moment she was absolutely still in the way that preceded either joy or disappointment, suspended at the exact point where the two were still indistinguishable from each other. Edric tested the joint slowly, rotating the wing through its full intended arc, up, spread, folded, up again, watching for any catch or resistance that might indicate the repair was surface only, and the stress having migrated somewhere less visible. It moved cleanly, smoothly, the way it had been designed to move before something had forced it wrong. He nodded once to himself and moved on. The housing was next, and this was where most people who attempted such repairs stopped and declared the thing unfixable. The mechanism inside was small and layered and unforgiving of imprecise intervention, the kind of construction that looked like chaos to an untrained eye, but was in fact a very specific order that could only be navigated if you understood the logic of its design from the inside out. Edric had spent years developing that understanding. He had also spent an afternoon early in his career grinding a tool to a very particular angle that the mechanism's design seemed to him to require. For his colleagues at the time had found this funny. A tinker making custom tools for hypothetical future repairs on objects he didn't yet own. It had seemed to them like the behavior of a man with too much time and too high an opinion of his own foresight. He had smiled and kept grinding. The custom tool found the housing's release point. The resin was the finest he carried, a small bottle, nearly half empty, that he rationed carefully because replacing it was not cheap and using too much was as bad as using too little. He applied it with a brush he had made himself from 3 strands of his own hair bound to a shaved-down matchstick, because nothing sold in any market he had ever visited was quite fine enough for the work he sometimes needed it to do. The crack in the bird's breast housing ran in a jagged line approximately 2 inches long, narrow at both ends, slightly wider at its center where the impact stress had been greatest. He followed it from left to right with the brush, laying the resin in a line so thin it was nearly invisible, filling the crack without flooding it, sealing the surface without altering the resonance of the material beneath. And the chime crystal inside needed clean, unimpeded vibration to sing correctly. Resin in the wrong place would dampen it. Resin in the right place, applied with sufficient precision, would simply make the housing whole again. He capped the bottle, set the bird carefully on the flattest section of cobblestone within reach, breast upward, so the resin could set without running. 2 minutes, he told the hatchling, in the same calm tone he had used throughout. We have to let it set properly or it won't hold. She looked at him. She looked at the bird. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated with remarkable clarity that 2 minutes was an extremely long time under current circumstances. I know, he said, and settled back against the alley wall to wait with her. And the city existed around them in the middle distance. Cartwheels on cobblestones somewhere to the north, voices trading the abbreviated language of closing time transactions, the bell from the temple district marking the 3/4 hour with its slow bronze patience. Sounds that belonged to a world continuing normally, indifferent to the specific sus. Edric picked up the bird. He did not announce that the 2 minutes were finished. He did not build toward the moment with preamble or preparation. He simply reached for the bird with the same steady hands that had worked on it throughout, turned it once to check the resin line, set cleanly, invisibly, exactly as intended, and found the winding key at its base with the familiar ease of long practice. The key turned smoothly. He felt the spring inside engage, felt the resistance build in careful increments as the mechanism drew taut, coiling potential energy into itself the way a held breath coils in a chest. He wound until the resistance told him to stop. Not a sound, not a click, just a feeling in his fingertips that 30 years of this particular work had taught him to read as fluently as language. He looked at the hatchling. She had gone completely still. The tail had stopped its tapping. Every part of her was suspended in that last terrible moment before the outcome arrived, and the hoping was either vindicated or ended, and she was bearing it with a dignity that Edric found, in a distant part of his mind, quietly remarkable for something so young. He released the catch. The wings opened. Both of them, left and right together, sweeping upward and outward in the smooth, simultaneous arc they had been designed for, the repaired joint moving as though it had never been bent, as though no alley floor and no impact and no silent, broken hours had ever happened to it. The brass feathers caught the last thin light filtering between the rooftops and scattered it in small, warm fragments across the alley walls, and then the chime spoke. 3 notes, rising. Bright and clear and perfectly, completely intact. They rang off the stone walls and came back from 3 directions at once, layering into something larger than 3 notes had any right to be in a space this small, filling the alley from cobblestone to roofline with a sound that was whole and mau. The exhale left Sarathiel slowly, like something that had been held too long finally permitted to move. She was not, as a rule, a creature who exhaled at things. 6 centuries of rulership had furnished her with a composure that most of her court described, privately and with some awe, as geological. The steadiness of something that had simply existed long enough that very little could move it perceptibly in any direction. She had received news of battles and treaties and deaths and disasters with the same considered stillness, processing each within the vast interior architecture of a mind that had learned to contain enormity without being reshaped by it. She was aware, therefore, of what it meant that a small brass bird singing 3 notes in an alley had moved her to exhale. Below, Advethus was clutching the bird to her chest with both claws pressed flat against it, as though physical contact might convince her more thoroughly that it was real, that it was whole, that the chime she could feel vibrating against her scales was genuinely happening, and not something she had constructed from wanting. Her golden eyes were fixed on the tinker's face, with an expression that required no translation across species or language, or the considerable gulf of 6 centuries between the observer and the observed. It was gratitude in its purest and most uncomplicated form, not the performed gratitude of courts, not the strategic gratitude of diplomacy, not gratitude freighted with obligation or angled toward future benefit. The gratitude of a child who had been alone with something broken and was now neither alone nor broken. Aka knew exactly who had changed that and wanted that person to know that she knew. Corvin said nothing. He had learned, across many years of service, to read the quality of his queen's silences, and this one did not invite speech of any kind. Sarathiel watched the tinker smile. It was a small smile, the private, unguarded kind that Arie. Edric's dinner was lentil soup, gone cold, with bread that had crossed from fresh into merely acceptable sometime around midday. He ate it at his small table by the window, with the unhurried contentment of a man who had never expected his meals to be remarkable, and had therefore never been disappointed by them. His landlord's cat occupied the opposite chair with the imperious comfort of a creature who had decided long ago that this room was partially hers, and Edric fed it a corner of the bread without being asked, which was their established evening arrangement. He thought about the hatchling once while washing his bowl, the sound she had made when the chime rang, the way it had arrived in his sternum without asking. Then he set the bowl to dry, banked the small stove, and went to bed. And within a week, it had settled into the same place most things settled in Edric's interior life. Not forgotten, precisely, but released. Filed somewhere quiet and warm and not frequently revisited. He had never seen the point of cataloging his own kindnesses. It seemed to him a particular kind of vanity, the keeping of that ledger, the periodic review of its entries to confirm one's own goodness. He did what seemed right when it seemed right, and then he moved on, because the moving on was part of doing it cleanly. He did not know about the investigators. Sarathiel had dispatched them the morning after, quietly and through channels that left no obvious trail of royal interest, because the last thing she wanted was for her inquiry to reach its subject and alter the information she was seeking. She wanted accounts, not performances. She wanted to know who Edric Mann was when nobody of any consequence was watching him, which was, she had concluded, the only version of a person that actually mattered. It took her people 4 days to compile what she needed. 3 separate testimonials from 3 separate witnesses across 3 separate incidents spanning the last human to receive royal recognition from the Veilthorn clutch had been a physician named Orvin Hale, 23 years prior, who had, during an outbreak of river fever in the lower districts, worked without sleep for 11 days, treating dragon hatchlings alongside human children with a dedication that had saved 14 young lives across both species. Sarathiel had drafted that letter in 20 minutes. Certain of her reasoning, the decision arrived at cleanly through the established calculus of extraordinary service rendered in extraordinary circumstances. She sat with this letter for considerably longer. It was not uncertainty about the decision itself. The decision had arrived, if she was truthful with herself. Somewhere around the moment she had watched those scarred hands tilt a small brass bird so a hatchling could see the repaired joint more clearly. It had simply taken her the intervening days to examine it from enough angles to trust it, to confirm that what she had seen in the alley was what she believed she had seen, and not something her own accumulated hopes about human nature had constructed over the raw material of one evening's observation. The testimonials had confirmed it. Not because 3 accounts proved a pattern with mathematical certainty, but because all 3 had the same quality, the same unremarkable, unannounced, entirely unauditioned quality of a man doing what seemed right without apparent awareness that it was notable. None of the witnesses had described Edric Mann as seeming conscious of being witnessed. None had described any performance of virtue. They had described, variously, a man who simply stopped when stopping seemed the obvious thing and sat down when sitting seemed what the moment required. She wrote the official portions of the letter in the formal register of draconic court tradition, precise, appropriately weighted, the language of recognition that carried legal and social consequence within. The landlord's name was Petra Sunch, and she was a woman of considerable practical resilience who had survived 30 years of running a building above a bakery, 2 difficult marriages, and a tenant who had once stored 40 pounds of clock parts in the communal hallway for a week without apparent awareness that this was unusual. She was not, by her own assessment, a woman easily unsettled. The royal seal on the letter unsettled her completely. She brought it upstairs with both hands, holding it slightly away from her body as though proximity to its authority might constitute some kind of presumption, and knocked on Edric's door with the careful knock of someone who has decided that whatever this is, it is absolutely not her business, while being entirely unable to stop herself from waiting in the hallway to see what happened. And Edric opened the door in his work clothes, a small gear still pinched between 2 fingers from whatever he had been doing, and looked at the letter with the mild curiosity of a man who received very little correspondence and found the concept faintly interesting. Then he saw the seal. He took it from Petra's hands with a care that suggested he understood, at least partially, what he was holding, and closed the door with the gentle automaticity of a man whose mind had already moved somewhere else entirely. Petra stood in the hallway for a moment, then removed herself with dignity. Inside, Edric read the letter once, standing up. Then he sat down on the edge of his bed and read it again. The formal portions he moved through carefully, parsing the court language with the patient attention he gave to anything written in a register he was not entirely fluent in, making sure he understood precisely what was being offered before he allowed himself to react to it. The workshop, the designation, the stipend, each landed with a weight his mind acknowledged and then set carefully aside for later consideration, because there was some. Edric's boots were old, resoled twice, the leather at the toes creased into permanent soft folds that had long since conformed to the exact shape of his feet. He laced them with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. Left boot, right boot, double knotted, because he had learned in his 20s that single knots came undone at inconvenient moments and had never seen sufficient reason to relearn the lesson. He put on his coat. He collected his satchel. He latched the door behind him and went down the stairs that smelled of burnt rye and out into the morning market that smelled of everything else. He was thinking about a broken clockwork he had promised to look at for the candlemaker 3 stalls down. He was thinking about whether the resin bottle needed replacing before the week was out. He was thinking in the peripheral and comfortable way of a man at ease with his own routine, about the particular small satisfactions of a day's work done with care. He was not thinking about queens or recognition, or the accumulated weight of what a single evening in an alley had set in motion. It did not occur to him to think about these things. It had not occurred to him that evening either, which was, though he would never know it, the entire point. Sarathiel stood at the window of her study that same morning, her tea cooling in her hand, looking at nothing in particular beyond the glass. She had spent 600 years developing an understanding of what made a person trustworthy. Not reliable in the transactional sense, not useful in the political sense, but trustworthy in the oldest and most fundamental meaning of the word, worthy of trust, deserving of the faith that another creature places in you when they are small and frightened and have run out of better options. It was not, she had concluded long ago, something that could be performed into existence. It could not be constructed from the outside in, assembled from correct behaviors,